The thing that has always been the most exciting and the most difficult and the most frustrating is that most people who come into the program do not find in the existent English language humanities scholarship the vocabulary that they need to talk about their practice. So they have to generate it. And an awful lot of the work that you do for your portfolio at qualifying examination level is an attempt to generate some vocabulary that will address some part of the practice that you have got and that other people might be able to use. You don't have to solve the whole thing. That's ridiculous. But if you could have just a little tiny bit of door opening or insight into something that you do that you haven't found other people being able to engage with you on, or maybe they engage but they don't know how to talk about it, and you think it's really central, or maybe they don't engage and it's because we learn how to recognize certain kinds of things. Art making in general is coming often from an area where we work with materials that we don't really know very well, if at all, if ever. But there are different things that come in when you make something, when you're an art maker and you make something, things that other people will probably not recognize. One of the reasons why many art makers are not recognized for the work that they do until 10, 20, 100 years after they do it, because people have to learn how to do that, how to recognize it, how to engage with it, how to participate in the energy that it is bringing into the world. So finding your own vocabulary is really important. And being able to enjoy that and kind of live through the frustrations of not having it is central to your existence in this program. And if you're looking for something and you can't find it, well, I mean, that's probably a good thing. It means you get to make it up. For the critical part of the work that people do here, and for the mainstream critic, as well as for the practice as research critic, writing is something that you will be expected to do. You are in an academic institution. You will need to read and you will need to write. And quite interestingly enough, when we first started the program, we were taking these amazing art workers into the program, and some of them didn't know how to read and write, and they had to be taught how to read and write. And that was tricky. It meant that the PhD went on a lot longer than one would have expected. But if you come in with some of those skills, it is definitely a benefit. You should be able to think of your writing as a practice and your reading as a practice. You need to be engaged with what you're writing and how you're writing it and how you think your reader is being met on the page and in the word and in the spaces between the letters and the spaces between the words. And it may be that you're very good at writing a fairly recognizable academic essay or chapter or whatever it is, in which case go ahead and do it. But make sure that you're not excluding the things that most of the time people can't even say yet, let alone recognize in the world of practice. The portfolio is comprised of 4 elements, usually. There's a journal, which you may or may not have kept when you were creating the thing that you want to focus the portfolio on, because it doesn't have to be something that you have done at UC Davis. It could be something you did 10 years ago. The journal is there really to help you understand when you made certain choices and what kind of changes those choices resulted in, and whether there are ways of thinking about the choices as new insights into methodology or into thinking or into what you know or how you handle the materials that you're handling. So while you're writing a journal, it's not a log of, I got up at 6 and I picked a bunch of flowers and I put them in a jar and then I went home and went to bed. It's more kind of picking up the bunch of flowers. I found myself lingering over the ones with hairy stems, or something like that. You're trying to give an account of what it felt like to do the thing that you're doing. We assume that you've got at least 10 years of practice, right? So, how does that open up things for you with the materials that you're dealing with? How do you make notes about that so that you don't forget that extraordinary moment when something amazing happened, like you suddenly realize that these hairy stems were something that you really enjoy or don't. So that's the journal, and the journal is really for you. It's very rarely read by anybody on the committee, except maybe your main advisor, a major professor, which is the curious term that people use at University of California, Davis, for their supervisor. But then the second element is what we would call the documenting. The third element is the thing itself that you are putting forward as the process of your practice. And then the last thing is a critical essay. The process of your practice, I deliberately didn't say the product of your practice because it may not be something that has stopped. It may be going on. That could be in text form. It could be in video form. Many people have created websites kind of going through the various things that happened in a musical performance or a theatrical performance or whatever it is that they're doing. And it's there as a kind of stopgap, because not everybody on your committee is going to be able to experience in person what it is that you're doing. It depends on the medium that you're using. But even if you're using a digital medium, there may be an enormous difference between seeing something that is digitally produced in a dark room with 10 other people, or by yourself, on sitting on a park bench waiting for a bus in downtown Berkeley or something, downtown Davis. The element of documenting, we used to say that this was the written version of what you think the practice process generated, so that anybody who didn't get to actually be there wouldn't just be faced with a kind of flat representation of what it is you had done, but had a way of really getting inside what it is that you felt that you were generating. The point of the piece of practice that you are sharing with your committee is really to provide a location for talking about things that you're finding difficulty finding a vocabulary for, because nobody else is talking about them, or because they're talking about them in ways that you don't agree with or enjoy or like, or you actually find very offensive, maybe. Maybe they're things that cannot be spoken about. And so finding ways of communicating what it is that you cannot speak about becomes very important. So the documenting is very affective. The piece itself, whether it's in video format or whatever, could be effective, but the documenting has got to be affective. It's got to take the person who's engaging with it into what it is you think that the process that you are sharing is enabling, is gifting to the people who you're sharing it with. Because this whole thing, the whole academic life, is about gifting. And this is gifting from a different knowledge source. So that's the documenting. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for people to get their head around the fact that they need to be able to think about writing as a practice. It doesn't have to be what we think of as normative writing, but it's a textual presencing rather than representation of what it is that you think that your practice is generating. The critical essay goes one step further than that. Normally what happens in a documenting is it may not even make sense, a documenting, but there's usually a little tiny thing in there where you find a way of talking about something that has been eluding you, and even if it isn't absolutely what it is that you want, you can begin to say, well, this is one way of thinking about it. In my own work, the use of the word rest with a bracket in front of it is a placeholder for something that I can't fully explain or anything, but most people who you talk to about it, if they make work, they know what you mean. So it's my kind of insertion, hoping that other people will talk about it and come up with other ways of thinking about it and communicating. But that if we don't get it out there as something that might be interesting to talk about, it's just going to go into that great unresearched, unvocabularied place, which we call art. And then you just don't talk about it. You just imagine that people are brilliant. They can't even share their brilliance because they're geniuses. I'm not genius. Anyway, the critical essay is the place where you take that little tiny thing and you write an essay around it, which is where you make the transition from practice into the academic world. The documenting is kind of a little step in there, and the critical essay usually comes after the documenting. Sometimes I've seen it where people have written the critical essay and they've realized there's a big gap in it. And they realize that that gap has to be filled, and it gets filled by the documenting often. Other times it just happens the other way around, where you're trying to articulate something and then you think, I could write about this. And then you go and have a look at what other people are saying in the fields, whatever field in performance studies that you think is the most relevant to you, because there are so many. You use the other two exams in the qualifying examination to pin down and narrow down for the purposes of providing something to stand on for what it is that you want to say. So in your critical essay, you often use a lot of the books and vocabularies and approaches and critical arguments and debates and comments and observations from other people to contextualize what it is that you're doing with your little piece. It's usually not as neat as that. It's usually a total mess, to be honest. But most of them are attempts. They are genuine essays. They try to do it. And sometimes they get somewhere with it that is very recognizable and exciting, and the adrenaline goes and all that. A lot of the time, it's really hard work. The two written exams that you are required to do, there's so many different ways of approaching those. John Rossini, when I first came to the university, said, well, in the United States, you need to have one that's based on teaching a kind of lower level undergraduate course, and one that's based maybe on an upper level undergraduate course, which is your sort of specialization, the way that you can take it out to a classroom, because your practice and research area is your research. And that's what you would be talking to your MA and your PhD students about. So you can do it that way. A classic example would be, for a dancer to do one paper on dance history or one paper on the background to contact improvisation. And then the other paper would be an upper level course, maybe on something like, I don't know, critical race and dance. And that would allow you to open things out in those ways. You can also do it slightly different way and think about what it is that you want to say in your critical essay, and decide that you want to do one paper which is a kind of literature review of the background to what it is that you think you want to talk about. If you wanted to talk about, you might want to talk about digital issues or gender issues, and you might want to do a background exam on that, just pinning down the top 25 to 50 texts that you think that if you were going to talk to somebody else, you would probably be drawing on them. And then the other one might be just a sort of slightly more focused thing. It could be, for example, using digital in installation art rather than using a digitally mediated, rather than an in-person mediated experience. So looking at the difference between in-person and not in-person mediated. The thing is that your two lists that you are required to write do not have to just be referencing written things. We give the advice of something like a minimum of 25 texts. It could be 5 books and 20 articles, but it could also include performances that you have seen and you want to reference and you want to analyze and bring into the discussion. If you're doing practice as research, then you may use your own work as well, but not your own work exclusively, unless you are asked to do so by the question that is on the exam, because we don't want you to simply get trapped into thinking within entirely your own terms. We want to know whether you can have conversations with other people, and they may be other performers as well as other critics. It's quite often the case that you'll get a bibliography of written text and then a videography or a danceography or a something other, environmental scienceography or a Native American studiesography. You should read through the descriptions on how to do these. The description says very clearly no more than about a page for the description of what it is you're doing. This is why I'm doing it. These are the people who've said things about it. These are the things that they don't cover. These are the questions that I've now got. And then the questions that you're asking yourself, and then the bibliography and the videography or whatever it is. It's not like 10 to 15 pages as they are in some departments like cultural studies. It's very short. Having said that, you don't have to only write 2. You do have the option of writing 3, Or your third can be a performance. You can perform an exam. I mean, you have to create a list for it, saying these are the things I want to dance, or these are things I want to do a media experiment with. And then the day before you do your in-person thing, you're asked a whole bunch of questions, and you choose a question or two questions, and you put them together, and you do your performance, whatever that performance is. Some people do 3 written exams because they want to look a little bit more normative, because most qualifying exams for humanities students are 3 written exams. You know, you do practice as research. I always used to say this to students, and you're doing 1.5 times the work of a normal PhD student. The dissertation prospectus is sometimes completely unrelated to the qualifying exam, but that means you've got to do even more work. In the case of performance studies, is expected to be between 10, 15 pages and 30 pages and not much longer. You are laying out in a classical way the landscape of the critical world that you are coming from, and that you're trying to have conversations with, in the same way that you would in the critical essay for the portfolio to some extent. You then go on to highlight, could even be bullet point, the 3 or 4 or 5 major things that you want to address in the dissertation. And if you have advanced far enough through some of the essay work or personal work or practice work that you've done to give more information on 1 or 2 of those areas, that's great. But the whole point about the dissertation is that, you know, you're doing research and you're going to find things that you don't expect, so you can't predict what they're going to be. Again, I would advise you to read the guidelines for how to write a dissertation prospectus. And they go into a little bit of what to expect with the actual dissertation itself, and what people who are going to read that dissertation or look at that dissertation and talk to you about it at the end of the process, what they are going to have some familiarity with. In other words, how is your audience going to interact with you? If you want to do a designated emphasis in another area, you're usually encouraged to do that. I do know people who've done 4 designated emphases. Most people do 1 or 2. You've got to remember that your practice as research is called the Designated Emphasis in Studies in Performance and Practice, and you have to sign up for that. A lot of people forget to sign up for it, and then you're not considered a practice as research student. So you need to remember to do that. But you can also sign up for Native American studies and science and technology studies and classics and rhetoric and all sorts of other things. You have to have somebody on your committee who represents that designated emphasis. And some people have 2 or 3 designated emphases groups that they are related to. For example, I'm in cultural studies, Native American studies, classics, critical theory. So, I mean, I've got lots of things that I'm related to. So I could represent all of those in just 1 person on your committee. But if not, then you've got to have 1 person on your committee from every single one of your designated emphases. The examination questions that they will ask you are going to be based on the ones that you put at the foot of your narrative on your examination list. Like let's say list 1 has a narrative with that 4-part thing that I told you about. Why am I doing this? Who says this? Where are the gaps? Why am I interested? What am I addressing? And then you follow that with the 3 or 4 questions that are for you the most important ones. Your committee is supposed to ask you versions of those questions, possibly with the emphasis on their particular discipline or designated emphasis. You do not have to answer that question. A lot of people like myself, I write interdisciplinary questions. The exam lists are intended to be interdisciplinary. And the only thing you have to worry about, I think, with some of the designated emphasis issues is making sure that the person who represents you on the committee understands that there is not going to be an exam list dedicated to their area, but that their area might crop up anywhere on any of the written exams that you write. And they can ask you questions in your oral examination that follows the written examination. If you haven't answered any of their questions, they can ask you in the oral exam, well, you didn't reply to my question on the dump-a-dump. But I'd like to hear what you have to think about it, or what you have to say about it. You've done all these courses in this area. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you would have responded to it if you were going to write about it. Or they can say things like, well, I read your critical essay and there's absolutely nothing about, but you didn't designate an emphasis in this area. Aren't you interested in it? My experience, it's different for every single person. I've known people who've written up a dissertation in a year and a half, 2 years. I know that's really, really quick. I've known people who have basically written most of the dissertation as part of their qualifying exam, and they don't take very much time at all, but they still usually take about a year or a year and a half. Many people, if they do a lot more field work, which is what you call, so the university knows what you're doing, the practice that you do for your dissertation can take up to another year or two, 3 or 4 years. But the University of California has a cap of 10 years. If you take in absentia or if you have PELP, then they get, added on to the 10 years. Most people finish, we hope they finish between 5 and 6 years altogether, from the beginning, including the qualifying exam, until the end. Now, in my experience, because I came from a system where PhDs only take 3 or 4 years, I kind of pushed people quite a bit. And our early number of years to dissertation was more like 4 or 5 years. I think it's expanded now, so it's more like 6 or 7 years, possibly even 8. But it depends on what kind of practice you're doing. You may want to write your entire dissertation around one thing that you have made in the context of a whole bunch of other things. And you don't have to make it again for the dissertation. So it's not going to take you a lot of time on field work. But on the other hand, you may want to include to make new things. A practice as research dissertation does not have to include any practice by you. But most people take the opportunity of being funded, even though at a very low level, to make new work. It's different for everybody. And it's also different depending upon who your supervisor is, your main advisor, your major professor. I mean, some people really want to see you every other week. Other people want to see you every other month. Some people want to see you every other year. When you find your dissertation, who you think is going to be your dissertation supervisor, you need to have a really good conversation with them, because for every student that a faculty member takes on, they kiss goodbye to 5% of their own research time. They will love working with you. They will learn so much from you, and I hope that you will learn with them about what they're doing. But they don't get any credit for it. They don't get any. The university doesn't thank you for it. They don't give you extra, bonus points because you take on lots of graduate students. You do it because you love and you are committed to whatever the graduate student is doing. It has to be very professional, but it is also kind of weirdly intimate. You have to keep things very upfront and open and make sure that you agree from the very beginning that you're the kind of person that needs to see your supervisor at least once a month. So don't tell me to come in once a quarter, And if they say, oh, no, I couldn't take you on that basis, then go find somebody else. It's got to be somebody that you can work with on a practical basis, as well as somebody that you can work with because you like what they do or you like their ideas.